Three black SUVs rolled through the iron gate at exactly 11:15 on a Saturday morning, slow enough that every neighbor on Windham Court had time to stop what they were doing and stare. The Langford family was on the front porch, all of them. Gerald in his weekend blazer, Catherine holding a glass of white wine that she suddenly seemed to have forgotten about, Megan standing beside them in a sundress, one hand frozen halfway to her mouth, and sitting on the porch steps between them, a 5-year-old girl in a yellow dress who saw the lead vehicle stop, looked directly at the driver's side door, and whispered one word: "Daddy." The door opened. I stepped out in full army dress blues, captain's bars on my shoulders, shoes polished sharp enough to reflect the Carolina sky. 2 soldiers stepped out behind me, not for show, not for intimidation, just because they happened to be the men I served with, and they'd asked to come. Gerald Langford stared at me the way people stare at something they were absolutely certain didn't exist. 5 years earlier, he'd stood in a hospital corridor, pointed a finger at my chest, and told me I was too poor, too broken, and too nothing to raise my own daughter. He told me I'd never amount to anything. He told me the kindest thing I could do for my child was disappear. I didn't disappear, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a boy from a part of town the Langfords had never driven through, and a girl who loved him anyway, and a family that decided love wasn't good enough if it showed up in the wrong tax bracket. My name is Kevin West. I grew up in Ridgemont, a neighborhood on the east side of Fayetteville, North Carolina, where the houses were small, the porches sagged, and everybody knew your business whether you told them or not. My mother, Denise West, raised me alone. She worked the early shift at the hospital laundry and the late shift answering phones at a property management office, and in between she somehow managed to make sure I did my homework, ate dinner at an actual table, and understood something she told me so many times it wore a groove into my memory. "Kevin," she'd say, usually while she was folding towels at the kitchen counter. "Too tired to sit down but too stubborn to stop moving, nobody in this world is going to hand you a thing. That's not a punishment, that's just the truth. But here's the part most people miss. The things you earn are the only things they can't take back from you." I believed her, not because I understood it at 17, but because she'd lived it in front of me for my entire life. She earned every paycheck. She earned the roof over our heads. She earned the respect of people who'd written her off a dozen times. And she never once complained about any of it, at least not where I could hear. I didn't have a father. He left before I was old enough to remember his face. My mother never spoke badly about him. She just didn't speak about him at all, which taught me something important. Silence about someone's absence can be louder than any explanation. I met Megan Langford during my junior year of high school, and everything I thought I understood about my life rearranged itself in about 30 seconds. She was a year below me, a sophomore who'd transferred from a private school across town because, as I'd later learn, she'd told her parents she wanted to know what real people were like. That phrase would have annoyed me if anyone else had said it. Coming from her, sitting cross-legged on the bleachers during a football game she clearly didn't care about, eating cheese fries with her fingers and laughing at her own jokes, it just sounded honest. She was beautiful in the kind of way that made you forget whatever you'd been thinking about before she walked in. But that wasn't why I fell for her. I fell for her because she listened the way almost nobody listens, with her whole body leaning in, like whatever you were saying was the most important sentence anyone had spoken all day. She did that with everyone, not just me. The lunch lady, the kid who stuttered in English class, the janitor who always hummed gospel music in the hallways. She treated every person like they mattered, and that kind of attention, when you've grown up feeling mostly invisible, is the most intoxicating thing in the world. We started dating that winter, and for about 2 years, everything was exactly as simple and good as two young people falling in love is supposed to be. Then I met her family. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The Langfords lived in a neighborhood I didn't even know existed until Megan gave me the address. Windham Court. Gated entrance. Houses set so far back from the road They looked like they were trying to hide from normal people. Lawns that were greener than anything natural had a right to be in a North Carolina July. Gerald Langford was a partner at one of the biggest commercial real estate firms in the Southeast. He had the kind of handshake that tells you a man has spent decades measuring other men against himself and finding most of them short. Catherine Langford came from old Raleigh money, the kind of family that named wings of hospitals and had portraits in country club lobbies. Together, they had built a life so polished that everything in it reflected their own image back at them. The first dinner was a disaster so quiet you could have mistaken it for politeness. Gerald shook my hand at the front door and held it exactly 1 second too long, studying my shoes, my shirt, the car I'd driven, my mother's 12-year-old Honda Civic with the dented rear bumper. "Kevin," he said, as though he were tasting the name and finding it insufficient. "Megan tells us you're from the East Side." "Yes, sir. And your mother works at the hospital?" "In the laundry department, yes, sir." He nodded slowly, the way you nod when you've already made a decision and you're just being polite enough to hear the rest. "Well, come in." Catherine was warmer on the surface but colder underneath, if that makes sense. She complimented my shirt, asked about my grades, and offered me sweet tea with the kind of practiced graciousness that fills a room without actually inviting you into it. I'd spent enough time around people who had nothing to recognize when someone with everything was performing generosity instead of feeling it. At dinner, Gerald asked me what my plans were after high school. I told him honestly, I was thinking about the Army. The table went quiet for a beat, not the comfortable kind. "The Army," Gerald repeated, setting down his fork. "Is that because of financial necessity or genuine interest?" "Both, sir." Megan reached under the table and squeezed my hand. I could feel her tension from across the tablecloth. "There's nothing wrong with the military," Gerald said carefully. "It gives young men structure, especially young men who might not have other paths available." The sentence landed like a brick wrapped in silk. He hadn't called me poor. He hadn't called me beneath his daughter. He'd simply arranged the words so that everyone at the table understood both things without him having to say either one directly. If you've ever sat at a dinner table where someone smiled at you while making it absolutely clear you didn't belong there, comment the word driveway below. Because what Gerald didn't know was that the boy sitting at his table eating his food and taking his insults was going to pull back into that same driveway years later and change everything he thought he understood about worth. Megan and I dated through my senior year. I enlisted in the Army the week after graduation, the same week her parents sent her to spend the summer at her aunt's house in Virginia, a move designed, I was fairly certain, to create enough distance that we'd simply fade apart. It didn't work. We called every night. We wrote letters, actual handwritten letters, because Megan said digital messages felt temporary and she wanted something she could hold. I still have every one of them in a shoebox under my bed. Basic training was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and the first time in my life I felt like I was becoming someone instead of just surviving as someone. I was good at it. Not the biggest, not the fastest, but the most consistent, the one who kept moving when other people sat down. My drill sergeant told me once, "West, you've got the one thing I can't teach these other idiots. You don't quit when it stops being fun." That sentence sounded exactly like something my mother would have said. I was 6 months into my first posting when Megan called me crying. "I'm pregnant." 2 words. My entire life pivoted on 2 words. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. Not joy, at first. Fear. The immediate, chest-crushing fear of a 20-year-old kid who made $18,000 a year and was living in a barracks room smaller than the Langford's guest bathroom. I thought about my mother raising me alone. I thought about my absent father. I thought about every statistic I'd ever heard about young parents and poverty and cycles that repeat themselves. And then I thought about the one thing my mother told me that mattered more than all the rest. The things you earn are the only things they can't take back from you. "I'm not going anywhere," I told Megan. "We'll figure this out." She believed me. Her parents did not. What happened next still sits in my memory like a wound that healed on the outside but stayed tender underneath, because Gerald and Catherine Langford didn't just disapprove of the pregnancy. They tried to erase me from it entirely. Gerald called me directly. Not Megan's phone. Mine, it was 11 at night, and his voice was the kind of calm that has rage running underneath it like an electrical current. I'm going to make this very simple for you, Kevin. You are a 20-year-old enlisted soldier with no education, no money, and no future that my daughter deserves to be attached to. If you care about Megan at all, you'll step aside and let us handle this properly. Handle it how? We'll support her. We'll make sure the child has everything it needs. You can visit. Occasionally, visit my own child. I'm offering you more than most men in your position deserve. I let that sentence hang in the dark for a long time. With all respect, Mr. Langford, I don't think you get to decide what I deserve. He hung up without another word. That was the last civil conversation we ever had. Lily was born on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with her mother's eyes and my mother's stubborn chin. I'd driven 11 hours through the night on emergency leave to be there. I walked into the hospital still in uniform, carrying a stuffed elephant I'd bought at a gas station outside Richmond because it was the only thing I could find at 3 in the morning. Megan was in the recovery room, exhausted and beautiful and holding our daughter against her chest like she was holding the whole world. She looked up when I came through the door and started crying before I could even speak. "She looks like you," she whispered. I reached out to hold her. My daughter. The first time. Gerald Langford stepped into the doorway behind me. "You're not family," he said. I turned around slowly. He was standing with both hands on the doorframe, blocking the entrance, wearing that same expression from the dinner table, the one where he arranges his face to look reasonable while saying something vicious. "This is a family moment, Kevin. Megan needs rest. The baby needs stability. And right now, you're not in a position to provide either." Megan's voice came from behind me, weak but fierce. "Dad, stop, sweetheart. You're exhausted. Let us handle. He's her father. He's a boy in a uniform." I looked at Gerald Langford, and I felt something shift inside me that has never shifted back. Not anger, exactly, something colder. The clear, steady recognition that this man would spend the rest of his life trying to convince the world, and my daughter, that I was nothing. And the equally clear recognition that the only way to prove him wrong wasn't to argue. It was to build something so undeniable that his opinion stopped mattering. I held my daughter for 20 minutes that morning. Gerald stood in the hallway the entire time, arms crossed, watching me like I was borrowing something that belonged to him. That hospital room was the last time I held Lily for almost 3 months. What happened over the next 5 years, the custody battles, the blocked phone calls, the birthdays I missed because Gerald's attorneys filed motions designed to delay and exhaust, is the part of this story that still wakes me up at night. But it's also the part that made me into the man who eventually drove back through those iron gates. What the Langfords didn't understand, what people who've always had money never seem to understand, is that desperation, if you refuse to let it break you, becomes the most powerful fuel that exists. I threw myself into the army the way drowning men throw themselves toward air. Every training opportunity, every deployment, every leadership course offered, I took it. Not because I loved the grind, because every promotion meant more money, every qualification meant more credibility, every medal meant one more piece of evidence that the boy Gerald Langford dismissed as nothing was becoming something. My first deployment was Afghanistan. 9 months in Helmand Province, where the heat pressed down on you like a physical weight and every road could be the last one you ever drove on. I won't tell you the details of what happened there, because most of what matters about combat doesn't translate into words that civilians can feel the way soldiers feel them. What I'll tell you instead is what it taught me. It taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that someone else's safety matters more than your own comfort. It taught me that leadership isn't about rank. It's about whether the person beside you trusts you enough to follow you into a room they can't see inside of. And it taught me that the men who talk loudest about what they do in dangerous situations are almost never the ones who actually do anything when the danger shows up. I thought about Gerald Langford more than once during those months, not with hatred, with something quieter. The understanding that he'd spent his entire life accumulating power over other people through money. and that he'd mistaken that power for strength. Real strength, the kind that holds a tourniquet on a friend's leg while bullets snap past your head, has nothing to do with bank accounts. Back home, things with Megan got complicated in the way things always get complicated when two people love each other, but one of them lives inside a family that treats that love like a disease to be managed. Megan tried. I believe that completely. She sent photos. She arranged video calls when her parents weren't home. She fought with Gerald behind closed doors. Arguments I'd hear fragments of through the phone, Megan's voice high and frustrated, Gerald's low and immovable. But money has gravity. When your parents pay your rent, your car insurance, your daughter's preschool, your medical bills, when they've structured your entire life so that independence feels impossible, walking away starts to look less like freedom and more like falling. Megan didn't leave her parents' orbit, not because she didn't want to, because she couldn't see the ground beneath her clearly enough to trust it would hold. The custody arrangement was technically joint, but in practice, it was whatever the Langfords' attorney could negotiate. I got Lily every other weekend, when I wasn't deployed, which meant some stretches lasted months. Every time I picked her up from that house, Gerald would stand on the porch and watch me load her into my car the way you'd watch someone borrow an expensive piece of equipment you expected them to break. He never said goodbye to me. He never asked where I was taking her. He simply stood there, radiating the quiet certainty that all of this, my presence, my rights, my fatherhood, was temporary. I kept coming back anyway. Lily grew up beautiful and curious and too smart for her own good. She had her mother's eyes, my mother's stubborn streak, and a laugh that could fill a whole room. Every other weekend I took her to the same park near my apartment, the one with the wooden bridge over the creek where she liked to throw rocks and watch the ripples spread. One afternoon when she was 5, she sat beside me on that bridge, legs dangling over the edge, and asked me a question so quiet I almost missed it. "Daddy, why don't Grandma and Grandpa want to see me when I'm with you?" I looked at my daughter, 5 years old, already carrying a weight she shouldn't have known existed. "They love you very much," I said, because that part was true. Gerald and Catherine loved Lily in the way they understood love, with money, with structure, with control. "But they don't like you," she said. Not a question, an observation. Some people have a hard time liking what they don't understand. She thought about that. "Do you understand me?" "Better than anyone in the world." She leaned against my arm and threw another rock into the creek. "Good," she said. "Because I understand you too." That sentence from a 5-year-old kept me going for the next 3 years. By the time Lily was 6, I'd been promoted twice. By the time she was 7, I'd completed officer candidate school, one of the hardest things the Army offers, and one of the proudest moments of my life. I called my mother the day I pinned on my lieutenant's bar, and she cried on the phone for 4 minutes straight before saying, "I told you. I told you they can't take back what you earn." 6 months later, she was gone. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late, the way it almost always is. She died on a Thursday evening in October, with me holding her hand and the last light of the day coming through her hospital window. I found the letter she'd left for me 3 days later, tucked inside the same shoebox where I kept Megan's letters. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words were steady. "Kevin, by the time you read this, I'll be somewhere I can't nag you from anymore, so I'm putting the last of it here. You were never poor. You were broke. There's a difference. Poor is a mindset. Broke is a situation. Situations change. Mindsets only change if you're brave enough to let them. The people who underestimate you are giving you the most useful gift in the world, time to prove them wrong while they're not watching. Don't waste it. And don't forget to eat breakfast. You always skip breakfast. I love you. I'm proud of you. Now go be the man I already know you are." I sat in her empty kitchen and cried until there was nothing left. Then I got up, ate breakfast, and went back to work. Over the next 2 years, I built a life so far beyond what Gerald Langford had imagined for me that his own assumptions became the biggest blind spot he'd ever have. And the morning I finally drove back to Windham Court, well, that was the morning his entire world rearranged itself. But before I tell you about the driveway, I need to tell you about the courtroom, because that's where the real fight happened. When Lily turned 7, I filed for full joint custody, Real joint custody, not the version the Langford's attorney had negotiated, where joint meant I was technically a parent, but practically a visitor. I could afford a real attorney now. Not a Langford-level firm, but a sharp family law specialist named Teresa Morales, who had a reputation for not being impressed by money. The first thing she told me was, "Courts don't care about your rank or their wealth. They care about one thing: what's best for the child. Our job is to prove that what's best for Lily includes having her father." Gerald hired the most expensive family attorney in the region, a man named Whitfield, who wore $3,000 suits and spoke in the kind of measured theatrical cadence that made everything sound reasonable even when it wasn't. The hearing lasted 2 days. Whitfield painted a picture of the Langford household as paradise, private school piano lessons, a stable 2-parent home with grandparents who doted on the child. He described me as a well-meaning but absent military father who moved frequently, deployed unpredictably, and couldn't offer the consistency a young girl needed. Teresa dismantled it piece by piece. She presented my deployment schedule and the fact that I had arranged childcare, family readiness plans, and backup guardianship for every single one. She presented my promotion record. She presented character testimony from my commanding officer, who said on the record, "Captain West is the most reliable man I've ever served with. If he says he'll be somewhere for his daughter, he'll be there." Then she presented the phone records. 14 months of blocked calls, 23 unanswered requests for additional visitation, 6 birthday and holiday visit requests denied with no explanation, and 1 email from Gerald Langford to Megan that Teresa read aloud to the courtroom. The less contact Lily has with him now, the easier the transition will be later. Children forget. That's a kindness. The judge looked up from her bench. She was in her 60s, gray-haired, and had the kind of expression that told you she'd heard every possible lie a family could tell in a courtroom and was no longer in the mood for any of them. She turned to Gerald, who was sitting behind Whitfield in the gallery. "Mr. Langford, would you like to explain to this court why a father with an exemplary military record, no criminal history, and documented financial stability was systematically denied access to his own child?" Gerald stood, buttoning his blazer the way men do when they believe the room still belongs to them. "Your Honor, our concern has always been for Lily's stability. Captain West's lifestyle, the deployments, the relocations is simply not conducive to." "Mr. Langford," the judge's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I asked you about denied access, not about your preferences for your granddaughter's upbringing. Those are different questions. Please answer the one I asked." Gerald opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time in my life, I watched a man who always had the perfect sentence come up completely empty. The ruling came down the following week. Full joint custody, equal time, no intermediaries, no blocked calls, and a note in the judge's written opinion that I've read so many times I could recite it from memory. The court finds no evidence that Captain West's military service has diminished his capacity or commitment as a father. To the contrary, the evidence suggests a pattern of deliberate obstruction by the maternal grandparents, whose financial influence over the mother has been used, whether intentionally or not, to marginalize the father's role. This court does not regard wealth as a parenting qualification, nor poverty as a parenting disqualification. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and read that paragraph 4 times. Then I called my mother's voicemail, which I'd kept active, paying the bill every month just to hear her voice, and I told her we won. But the courtroom wasn't the moment that changed everything. The courtroom gave me my rights. What happened at the Langford's driveway gave me something the law can't hand you: respect from people who never thought you'd earn it. The morning I drove to Windham Court to pick up Lily under the new custody order was the first time I'd been back to that house since the hospital. I could have come alone. A car, a handshake, a signature on the custody transfer form. Simple. But 2 of the men I'd served with in Afghanistan, Rivera and Jackson, both sergeants, both men who'd carried wounded soldiers out of places I still don't talk about, had driven down to visit me that week. When I told them where I was going, Rivera looked at me and said, "We're coming with you. You don't have to. Brother, you spent 3 years making sure we came home. "We're driving you to pick up your daughter." Jackson just grabbed his keys and walked toward the car. We took 3 vehicles because Rivera's truck was in the shop and Jackson refused to leave his behind. 3 black SUVs, government plates, rolling through the iron gate at Windham Court on a Saturday morning while the neighbors watered their lawns and tried not to stare. I want to be clear about something. This wasn't a show of force. It wasn't intimidation. It was 3 men who'd been through things together that bonded them deeper than blood, showing up for each other the way they always had. The fact that it happened to look like something out of a movie was an accident. The fact that it terrified Gerald Langford was a bonus. The Langfords were on the porch. All of them. Gerald's face went through 3 expressions in about 4 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and something I'd never seen on him before. Uncertainty. The specific uncertainty of a man who has spent years believing he controls every variable, suddenly confronted with a variable he never accounted for. Catherine set her wine glass down on the porch railing so carefully it might have been made of something more fragile than glass. Megan stared at me. Not at the SUVs, not at the uniform, at me. And something in her face told me she was seeing, for the first time in years, the man she'd fallen in love with, not the boy her father had described, but the man that boy had become while nobody in this house was paying attention. And Lily, my Lily, was sitting on the porch steps in a yellow dress, and the moment she saw me step out of that vehicle, her whole face lit up like sunrise. "Daddy." She ran across the lawn barefoot, and I knelt down and caught her the way I'd imagined catching her for every single one of the days I'd spent overseas. In dusty rooms and armored vehicles and military bunks, holding her photograph against my chest and promising myself that I would come home and I would be enough. She wrapped her arms around my neck. "You're wearing your fancy clothes," she said. "Special occasion," I told her. "Is it because of me?" "Everything's because of you." Behind her, Gerald Langford stood on his porch and watched his granddaughter cling to the man he'd called nothing. Rivera and Jackson stood beside the SUVs, hands clasped, parade rest, not saying a word. They didn't need to. Their presence said everything. I carried Lily toward the car, and as I passed the porch, I stopped. Not to gloat, not to deliver a speech. I'd spent years thinking about what I'd say to Gerald Langford if I ever stood in front of him as an equal. I'd rehearsed sentences in my head during long flights and longer deployments. Angry sentences, proud sentences, vengeful sentences. When the moment actually came, I said something I didn't plan. "Mr. Langford." I looked at him directly. My daughter on my hip, my uniform on my back, my brothers behind me. "You told me once that I wasn't in a position to provide for my daughter. I want you to know, I never stopped providing for her. Not once. Even when you made it as hard as possible. The difference between us was never money. It was that you measured a father's worth by his bank account, and I measured it by whether my daughter knew I'd always come back for her." Gerald said nothing. His jaw worked once, like he was chewing on a response he couldn't quite swallow. Catherine looked at the ground. Megan's eyes were wet. She always knew. Megan said quietly from the porch, "Even when you weren't here." She knew. I nodded at her. There was nothing between us anymore except a daughter we both loved and a history too complicated to untangle in a driveway. But that sentence, "she knew," was enough. I wish I could tell you Gerald Langford apologized that day. He didn't. Apologies from men like Gerald don't arrive in single dramatic moments. They arrive slowly, over months and years, in the form of behaviors that quietly change direction. The first Thanksgiving after the custody ruling, Gerald called me. Not Megan. Me. His voice was stiff, uncomfortable, like a man wearing a suit that doesn't quite fit. "Lily wants you at dinner," he said. "Do you?" A long pause. "I think it's important for her to see her family together." That wasn't an apology, but it was a door cracking open, and I'd learned enough about patience to know that you don't kick open doors that are already moving. I went. I wore a suit this time, not the uniform. I brought a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford and a sweet potato pie made from my mother's recipe, the same recipe she used to make when money was tight but love never was. Dinner was awkward in the way first attempts at anything important always are. Gerald asked me about my work, not as a test this time, as a question. Catherine complimented the pie, and I watched her take a second slice when she thought nobody was looking. Lily sat between Megan and me, chattering about kindergarten, completely unbothered by the tension the adults were still carrying, because children understand peace instinctively when you give them permission to feel it. After dinner, Gerald found me alone on the back porch. "I owe you something," he said, staring at the tree line. "You don't owe me anything. I owe you an explanation at least." He was quiet for a long time. "When Megan brought you home, I saw a version of every fear I'd ever had about her future. Not because of who you were, because of where you came from. I grew up with nothing myself, Kevin. Most people don't know that. I built everything you see here from a used desk and a phone book, and I spent the next 30 years terrified that it would all disappear." He looked at me. "When I looked at you, I didn't see a bad kid. I saw what I used to be. And I was so afraid of my daughter living the life I escaped that I tried to remove anyone who reminded me of it. Including me. Including you." He paused again. That was wrong. It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't performed for an audience. It was two men standing on a porch, one of them finally honest enough to say what the other had always suspected. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Gerald said. "I'm not sure I can yet," I told him honestly. "But I'm here, and I'll keep showing up. That's the best I've got right now." He nodded slowly, like that answer was enough. Maybe it was. Forgiveness doesn't arrive on command. It builds, one honest conversation at a time, in rooms where people finally stop performing and start talking. A few weeks later, Lily and I were back at our park, sitting on the wooden bridge, throwing rocks into the creek the way we'd been doing since she was 3. "Daddy?" "Yeah, baby. Grandpa talks about you different now." "Different how?" She thought about it carefully, the way children do when they're trying to translate adult behavior into words. "Before, he talked about you like you were a problem. Now he talks about you like you're a person." I laughed, because sometimes 5-year-olds say things that would take an adult a whole book to express. "That's progress," I said. "What's progress?" "When things get a little better, even when they're not all the way better yet." She threw another rock. Watched the ripples. "I think progress is good." "So do I." She looked up at me with those eyes, her mother's eyes, my mother's stubbornness, and something entirely her own that I couldn't name but recognized immediately. It was the same thing I'd felt driving through those iron gates. Not victory, not revenge, something quieter and more durable. The certainty that I had earned my place at the table, and no one, not money, not judgment, not fear, could take it back. People ask me sometimes whether I resent the years I lost. The blocked calls, the missed birthdays, the 3 months after Lily was born when I wasn't allowed to hold her. The look on Gerald Langford's face in that hospital doorway when he told me I wasn't family. I'd be lying if I said none of it still stings. It does. Some wounds heal into scars, and scars don't disappear just because you've made peace with how you got them. But resentment is a leash. It keeps you tied to the people who hurt you, walking in circles around a post they built, mistaking the movement for progress. I watched my mother live without resentment for 18 years, and I watched her die the same way, peaceful, certain, proud of what she'd built and who she'd raised. She was right about everything. The things you earn are the only things they can't take back. Situations change, but only if your mindset changes first. And the people who underestimate you really are giving you a gift, time to become something they never imagined, while they're too busy counting you out to notice. I'm 31 years old now. I'm a captain in the United States Army. My daughter knows my voice, my face, and my promise that I will always come back for her. And every other weekend, when I pull into the driveway at Windham Court to pick her up, Gerald Langford walks out to the porch, nods at me, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, says something that sounds almost like respect. We're not there yet, but we're closer than we were, and progress, as Lily would say, is good. If this story reminded you of someone who was counted out before they had a chance to prove what they were made of, a young father, a single parent, anyone who was told they weren't enough, comment the word driveway below and tell me which part hit you hardest. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge. We tell stories about the moments that test families and the people who rise to meet them. Hit that bell so you never miss one. Because sometimes the greatest thing a man can do isn't prove everybody wrong, it's proving his daughter right.